open up the webinar, and this will allow people to start coming into the room.
Okay.
And you can see the welcome screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. So people are starting to come in. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Franklin Escobedo. I'm the Community Services Director here at the Larkspur Library. And we're going to be recording today's session. So if for some reason you get bumped off the internet, we'll be posting this to the library's YouTube channel, where you can watch our other author events as well as all of our other programmings that we were able to record. We've only had a few technical errors and a couple of places that told us we couldn't record. So some of our museum talks are not recorded because the museum won't let us, even though we'd love to show those. And our children's events and book clubs are not recorded as well. So if you miss a book club, you just got to join the next book club to ask about the last book we read. So we're going to give it a few more minutes as people come into the room. Again, today, use the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen, to ask your questions. We'll be taking questions at the end. So get your questions ready. And so we'll give it a few more minutes here as people come in. I know people get stuck sometimes getting into the Zoom. Even though the church bells have rung, my phone says it's not 2 o'clock yet. So I don't know who I need to ask at the church to reset their bell tower.
Do they actually ring?
Yeah, the bells ring every hour on the hour in across the street at St. Patrick's, but they're like 2 minutes fast compared to the clock on my phone. So.
Oh, that's funny. That's very funny. Because in Antigua, Guatemala, the bells always ring, but
it's a nice comforting thing, except when it doesn't ring, we're like, something's wrong. The bells aren't ringing. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our author talk. Today we're joined, here, I'll turn this off so everybody can see us. We're joined by our local author, Jessica O'Dwyer. We're here to talk about her first, it's not her first book, but it's her first book of fiction, Mother, Mother, a novel. Jessica O'Dwyer lives here in Marin County, but I'm just really excited to talk about this book. It was an emotional roller coaster. It's a great book. It made me cry in certain parts. This is a book too that if you're thinking about adopting a child, you should really read. I know she has a nonfiction book called Mamalita, which is a memoir, which probably has more stuff in it, but you can tell she has done research for this book. So first, let me just introduce Jessica O'Dwyer, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself before we jump into the questions about the book.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Franklin. This is such a great service for the local writers, local authors, and community. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for coming. I know it's the middle of the day for most of us, so I really appreciate your coming. I am a mom to two, I'm an adoptive mother to 2 children from Guatemala, which is sort of the ground I stand on, and it informs everything about me. I've been writing my whole life. I started keeping a journal when I was 10. I've worked in PR, I've worked in magazine publishing, I've worked in book publishing, and then when we adopted Olivia, I decided to write. I needed to write a memoir, which was Mamalita, and now I have my novel, which brings me here. Thank you.
So I guess we'll start with how the book it's a timeline of Julie's story of her adoption, but it starts in such a powerful way, in a way that, I mean, it's an unexpected beginning, but it's the reason why she wants to adopt. And I think any woman who's had a miscarriage can relate to Julie's problem, but it's such a way to start a book, to really throw you into that deep water of grief and of loss. And then later in the story, you have, I mean, I want to say it was a few chapters in where we get to meet Rosalba. What made you decide to put the layer, I guess, to space those 2 stories apart the way you did?
Oh, that's such a good question, Franklin. That's such a writerly question, really, because it's how do you find your way into the story? And, you know, you really have to have the inciting incident. So for each mother, for Julie, it was having her 3rd miscarriage in a parking garage. And for Rosalba, it was being the lone survivor of a massacre in the 1980s during Guatemala's 36-year armed conflict. So I will tell you an interesting tidbit, which is that originally Rosalba's story started the book.
Mm-hmm.
Originally, I started with her story, and I started with the massacre that happened in a village. And it was so distressing to my beta readers that they almost couldn't get beyond it. And so I decided to flip those two stories and have Rosalba's story begin a little bit later after we had already met Julie.
Okay, well too, and it's also, I think, after the point where, because the first child that they get to sponsor to adopt, it falls through. And I guess that happens a lot with anybody adopting someone. You get your hopes up that you're going to be able to get this baby, and then it falls apart. And there's, in a lot of the book, really, it does deal with that, the identification of a child. Is it really that child's parent that's giving them up for adoption? And this is, I guess you've done research on this, and you've have the research to go with it. And I think it's a problem across the world, right?
Well, it's, you know, it happens rarely, but it happens enough that I thought that it needed to be included in the story. So I have a very large circle of adoptive family friends, and there is a percentage of people who get a referral, as we call it, a referral, which means you're matched with a baby, and then it falls through. And so I felt that that was a real part of what happens to adoptive parents, because what you do is you fall in love with this image of this child. You fall in love with a picture. You fall in love with the name. And it's hard sometimes for people who are not involved in adoption to understand that, to sort of say, well, how can you fall in love with a JPEG? And that's why I wanted to include that, to sort of help people understand what that feels like. So, and in domestic adoption, in private adoption in the United States, sometimes a birth mother changes her mind. Sometimes she finds a different family. So it's a fraught process, and it's not a straightforward process. And I wanted to bring that up so that people would understand what that feels like from inside.
You know, and you do a great job of putting that emotion into it, because I think anybody who would find somebody that they're hoping to bring into their family and then have it slip away, it's just like it takes you right back to the beginning of the book, where it is like another type of miscarriage, where you had all this hopes built up. And I think too, with Julie's story, there's so many stresses on her and the family that you do a very eloquent job of showing that throughout the story, because there's the story of her trying to adopt. There's the story of her career and the turmoil at the museum. And then there's the story of her and her husband. And then finally, when Jack, or Juan and then Jack come into this, there are all these different elements to the story. And I think you do a great job of threading that throughout the whole book. I guess it's like, I mean, you really went the full length. Like you said, it's the roller coaster of emotions through the book. I think I don't know. How do you say you want to take something out or put something in, or did you leave something out that we didn't even get to see? Because
I left a lot out that you didn't get to see. You know, in the process of writing this, there were thousands and thousands of words that I cut. There were entire characters who were in there who didn't make it. But really, it's the narrative thread, it's the drive, it's the train moving forward. I wanted to write a book that people just couldn't put down and wanted to keep reading, because that's the kind of book I like to read. I like to read a book that keeps me turning the pages. So anything that wasn't driving the action or the emotion, you know, didn't make the final cut. And so to your question of how do you decide, I actually had a very detailed outline for this book. And I learned the hard way through my first book that I really needed to write an outline, and that an outline would be my guidepost. And what was really interesting about the process was I had the outline, and then I would go to bed at night, thinking about the book, and of course, obsessed. And these dreams would come to me, and these sort of storylines would just come to my subconscious. And so there goes the outline that I thought was going to happen. And these subplots revealed themselves to me So that was a really exciting part of the process.
Where should we go now? There's so much to talk about. I guess if there, I mean, there's the big storyline with Jack, who is originally Juan, but he changes his name. I mean, you really address the issue of the other in the family, and I think I mean, me growing up, I've had the background too, where you're sort of an other in a school where you don't see many people like yourself, and you really, I don't know if a lot of people realize it, but you did a great job of showing Jack's stresses through that process. I mean, what kind of other experience did you interview people? Did you talk, I mean, did you talk to your own kids about this kind of feeling? I mean, also too, Jack has that, he never says it out loud, but you can get it from his actions of this terror of being turned away or returned, because this poor little boy is like ironing his clothes, you know, ironing his sheets, you know, trying to be this perfect little kid for them. How did you get the research and because you do it's a great job of showing that in the book. What was your research method for finding this to share with us? So.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Franklin. That really means a lot to me, your observations. I really appreciate that. Well, my daughter is now 18 and my son is about to turn 16 in a few weeks. So I have had, you know, almost 2 decades of experience as an adoptive mother. And, you know, I closely watch my children, as all parents do. And I'm also connected to a huge, huge group of adoptive families. You know, in person, I have a big group that we belong to, and online, I'm also connected to literally thousands of people. So I'm aware of the feelings of a lot of people involved in adoption. And really the key issue that I focused on with Jack was his fear of being abandoned again. So in adoption, we have something that psychologists have termed the primal wound. And the primal wound is what occurs when a baby is separated from her mother, her biological mother. And it's a separation that happens, you know, often right at birth. And it's a loss. And that's a loss that really marks a person. And so Juan/Jack is sort of manifesting that loss throughout his life. His terror is that he will be left again. So he's decided, I'm going to have to be the perfect child so that I will be above reproach and no one will abandon me again.
And I think it stems back for the chapter where he's taken away at the age 5 and put into the state-run orphanage. And that, I think, was for me the most upsetting part of the book, getting to that part at the beginning where Julie goes to Guatemala, and then a few weeks later he's put into the state-run orphanage. And when she goes back to see him, because as you learn, this is not a quick process. Julie is determined to adopt this. And I realized that, like, at some point I wanted her to tell him, we waited so long to get you, why would we give you away? But that, I think, was the most emotional part of the book, is when you know her terror that he's been put in the state-run orphanage and she has to see that. I'm assuming you've visited places like this, or you've done the research, and I think I also love that the network that you have in the real world is reflected here in the book as well.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I thank them in the acknowledgments, and because my group is my lifeline, I call them. So I'm very grateful to all of my community. People chose to adopt from Guatemala, including us. One of the reasons was they have a foster care system, which was that children were placed in private homes with families instead of in state-run orphanages. And so what happens sometimes is that if there's the government, the court, for whatever reason, decides that a child is going to be removed and put in the state-run orphanage. And to answer your question, yes, I have been to places like that. So not quite so terrible as the one that I described, but to places where there are group homes for children. And so yes, I have. I've been to Guatemala many, many, many times, and I've been inside places that probably most people haven't been inside. And that allowed me to really write.
You paused for a moment there.
Oh,
so,
did I? Am I back?
No, you're back, but it just right at the end of your sentence, it stopped. So.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, because our Wi-Fi goes on and off a lot somehow for some reason. It went off today. I was freaking out. I was like, oh my God, earlier. So what I just said was that, yes, I have been to places like that. Probably not quite as bad, but yes, I have. And that's so interesting, Franklin, that's the place that that really resonated for you, because I was going to read a section if you wanted me to, and it was from that part of the book.
Oh yeah, well, no, do you want to read it now? Or you want to wait a little?
So whatever you want me to, but that's fascinating because that's the part I chose. And
well, yeah, it's a really, I mean, to know that for both of them, for Julie to have, her and her husband, which now I've forgotten the name.
Mark.
This trips to go down there, because this is also happening when she's, applying to be the director of a museum. She has all this pressure at work, and then she already has this arrangement to go to Guatemala to see him, and then to find out that he gets pulled and put into this state-run orphanage. It was just one of these really like heartbreaking things, because how much she wants him, and how much trouble, and to see how long that now we have gone with her 5 years of this process, getting closer and closer to the finale, and then all of a sudden he's put into the state orphanage. And I think that was one of the why it's like you have the emotion, and you did a great job of putting that into the book, of this emotional buildup of this. Julie is serious about getting Juan, that there's no doubt in the reader's mind that she's committed to getting him. And so when he gets pulled away, it just makes you think, what's going on? What has the state found out that we don't know what's going to happen? Is something going to jump out at us and unravel the whole process? And
yes. And, I think that it speaks to the fierceness that parents have for their children. That's what I really wanted to communicate, that you're really willing to fight for your child, because at that point, he is your child, and you can't imagine that he isn't your child. So you'll do whatever it takes, because you don't want that child to be lost in the system, which is what happened to their first referral of the little boy, Felix, the baby, who they lost. And Julie never finds out what happened to him. She doesn't know, and she's kind of haunted by that. And so she doesn't want to abandon Juan to the same fate. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Do you want me to read a few paragraphs? Or not now?
Read something, because I still got lots of other questions too. So it's choppy. So if it stops, I'll try to stop you if you lose your connection. So
okay, well, I'll just let's see. Okay, so I'm just going to read like 3 paragraphs. Say, so this is when Julie drives up with the taxi driver to Carlos, who's her taxi driver, and they're driving up to the orphanage. So I'll just give a quick description. A few blocks later, they passed through blocks of cement row houses with rolled down aluminum doors, and streets full of dusty cars and packs of roaming dogs. They were deep in the Guatemala they saw on the news, but had never experienced in the Marriott Hotel neighborhood. Almost there, Carlos said. A few blocks later, he yanked the steering wheel to the left and pulled up to a driveway in front of a cement wall with a massive steel door. Leaping out of the driver's seat with the engine running, he spoke into a keypad, and the gate creaked open. A guard in an orange vest waved them in, and Julie turned to see the gate creak shut and the orange-vested man secure it with a steel bar. A 2-story concrete building stood at the end of a dirt driveway. Every window was barred. Although the orphanage housed 60 children, there was no physical evidence of children. No scattered toys, no bicycles laid on their sides, waiting for a girl or boy to jump on and pedal. Aside from the dirt itself, the dirt courtyard was spotless. Along the edge of the driveway, 10 to 15 teenage boys and girls sat on a low wall, leaning into each other and chatting, tossing pebbles at the ground, or simply staring at Julie as the car drove by. They were waiting for family to visit, Carlos explained with a gruff snicker. Except family never did visit. Not once had Carlos ever seen a relative visit the orphanage. Okay, I'll stop there.
I mean, you do a great job of setting up the oh, how am I was trying to fix this. Oh, there we go. It's setting up the scene. I mean, in this, then you go in, she has a birthday cake.
Yes. Do you want me to read that? Or?
I think that's what it is. It's also because it's a birthday, and that makes it this hard. And then you know that these poor kids are being. It's not the best place in the world. It's not that, she smells bleach in the place because the kids are cleaning, and then when they give him the piece of cake and the lady comes in and says, you can't have the cake. I mean, there are all these things that make that. That's why I thought this was a really emotional part of the book. I mean, there are others in the book. There's don't take me wrong. I mean, like I said, this book is an emotional roller coaster. And even the ending it's perfect. It's that leaves you wanting more, and it's the best way. And those are the novels. And I think that's why I love it so much too. You've written this conclusion that just makes me want more. And those are the best kind of novels to read, is when you're like, what else happened? So we won't go into the ending, but I really did like, and I don't know, a lot of people don't realize the kind of, the issues that indigenous people have with the colonies. And you really do go into this, and especially with Rosalba's story, even just the massacre that happens in her village. And as you slowly learn her story, you see this sort of the sort of conflict that happens in most Latin American countries against the indigenous, the Mayans, and the colonials, or what they were called. They have a word for it. Yeah.
In Ladinos.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So could you go into a little more about the history of that and your research into the background of how you included this?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So Guatemala is the minority now. The indigenous people are Maya, who have been there since time immemorial. And then in 15 something, when they were conquered by Alvarado. And that was sort of the beginning of the bifurcated society in Guatemala. So there's a lot of discrimination against indigenous people in Guatemala. And by discrimination, I mean lack of health care, lack of education, lack of schools being built, lack of running water, lack of teachers who speak the language. There's many languages, unique languages in Guatemala, and teachers don't necessarily speak those languages. There's, overwhelming poverty. So how I became interested in that was my daughter's family is Quiche Maya, which is one of the indigenous groups. And I really honestly knew very little about Guatemala's history until I started having family members who were Quiche. So I started learning about that, and I started doing research about it. I started reading about it. I started watching movies about it. I read diaries in translation. I read just anything I could get my hands on. I've been to churches, I've been to villages, I've traveled all over the country. So I knew that this was an integral part of this story. And I knew that adoption, as it was practiced in Guatemala, was really an outgrowth of the oppression in general that had happened against indigenous people. Mm-hmm.
Well, and even Rosalba, when she's rescued from her village, and as time goes by, when
Eldon.
Yeah, Eldon sort of points out to her that, that's not your family. And you start to see how they treat her, even within her own household, where she thinks that she's one of the children that she's grown up with them. And then all of a sudden when Tio tells her this, she starts to see the difference, which sort of impacts the whole family later on when her sister gets married off to the guy, that her sister didn't know how to cook, didn't know how to make the tortillas because she had been doing it all. She was the one that was sort of turned into the servant without her realizing that she was the servant in the household.
Yes. So in Guatemala, there's something, and in many countries, and probably here and of course here in the United States, there's something we call informal adoption, which is, you know, there's no paperwork signed, but you're just kind of brought in. So Rosalba was the lone survivor of a massacre, and her father, the man who she believed was her father, Chelo, who took her home, and they raised her like their own child, and I'm saying their own, by that I mean as their biological child. I shouldn't, you know, I have to be careful with that, as I say in the book. But she is always kind of a little bit different. So if there's a job to be done, she's the one. If there's some cleaning, if there's some tortilla making, you know, it's all going on her. And eventually when Eldon reveals to her that she was actually brought into the family, it all kind of clicks into place for her. So, yeah. Well,
and I think that's a reason too why some people would choose to send their children to adoption, especially because this, you know, dream of the Estados, you know, the United States is this huge dream that a lot of Latin American people have of this myth of the United States. They hear this myth that, you know, we're the land where the roads are paved in gold, and we've perpetuated that myth since the gold rush. It's a land of opportunity, and that's why her father, you know, goes to, and we don't know what happens to the father.
The Chelo. Yeah. Yes, and that's something I deliberately left open. One of the stories that ended up on the cutting room floor was that he was working in a place that they met, but that didn't make the cut. But I'm so interested in this subject because the subject of migration, just because it has such an impact on Guatemala, on the United States, and also on the people who are left at home in Guatemala. Mm-hmm. So that's something we don't really examine that much, but that's something I observe often in Guatemala, because I'll go to a village, say, and there's no men there. There's very few men there, and many of the men, because of financial hardship in their village, because of whatever gangs trying to recruit them, you know, for whatever reason, they decide it makes more sense for them to go north. And then there leaves a void of these women and children who are left behind. And so that's what happens to Rosalba. You know, Chelo leaves, and then she says, we're like a field we're like crops planted on the hillside in the rain. We're just drifting down, and it's a challenge, and it's difficult, and she's vulnerable. That's where her vulnerability comes from. Mm-hmm.
No, and I think that it brings up the subject of love, and you do discuss this a lot in the book. The love of where is it biological or an emotional attachment? And I thought you did a really good job of, I mean, the interaction between Julie, who Julie meets later on in the book, who's also an adoptive mother. Their views are sort of divergent on how they treat the children they love, that there's no distinction between a biological child and an adopted child. And I thought you did a really good job of talking about that in the book, because I think you come across people in your life who are this way, that they don't believe that you can love somebody that's not of your own genetic makeup. And I thought you did a great way. And did you want to talk more about that and why you think it's very important to remind people that if you adopt somebody, you're going to love them no matter what, right?
Well, I certainly am. You know, and that's one of the storylines is Piper, who's another adoptive mother who Julie meets, who faces her own challenges that we don't have to get into. But it's kind of like two different approaches. You know, Julie says, my whole life revolves around my child, and my whole life has become Guatemala and adoption and my child's needs. And the other mother says, well, kind of, we expect these kids to come into our family and mold to our culture of what our family culture is. So there's two different mindsets, but I will say, I know maybe I'm lucky, but all of the adoptive parents I know, their lives are completely dedicated to their children, and they love their children as much as I think anyone can love anyone. I mean, I don't know how to compare love, but I can say that we love our children wholeheartedly, and that's what I know. And that's what I did try to explain. That's what I hope people come away from the book with a deeper understanding of what it means that adoptive parents love their children, just like you who gave birth to your child, you love your child. No?
Well, and I think the parents who have adopted, and you meet them later on in the book when they go to the camp, the Guatemala camp, it's trying to instill in the children who they've adopted their cultural past. And I have a cousin who's adopted, and her mom did the same thing. You try to give them that connection so they don't feel disconnected when they're here in the States versus where they may have originated from.
It's a challenge. It's a challenge, you know, and it's a challenge for my kids. I mean, we go to Guatemala every year, and we go for a month. And, you know, we've been to Heritage Camp many times, and I love Heritage Camp, and I've learned a lot from Heritage Camp. And all of us adoptive parents are really marching forward, trying to do everything we can for our kids. But I will tell you, when I go to Guatemala with my daughter and my son, my daughter says to me every time, when I'm in Guatemala, I'm American. And when I'm in America, I'm Guatemalan. So it's sort of, they really have to navigate two cultures. And I am in awe of their ability to do that. They really navigate it very well. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge because they're kind of both and neither. And for a lot of our kids, their parents are white, you know, they don't look like them, and people know they're adopted and what that means. And, you know, so what you say is true. It's, you know, we as adoptive parents, we really do try to incorporate culture into our kids' lives, but that's not the same thing as growing up in your culture.
Well, and even that part of talking about, oh, they're adopted, that's Julie's fear of somebody constantly sort of harassing her child or themselves, that their child is different. And I think that the first interaction with Piper, it sort of gets brought up again, that there's this fear of like, is this really your child kind of thing, that kind of feeling that Julie has, this fear of being sort of put on the spot, or to make Jack feel different.
Yeah, I think it's more her protectiveness of her son, that she doesn't want him to feel that way. And, you know, one of the things she says is, do I have to educate every person in the universe about this? Because at one scene, Jack is really sad and upset. And finally it comes out that somebody in school said to him, you're adopted, like it was a bad thing. And, you know, that really hurt him deeply. And she, as his mother, really is trying to protect him from that.
Well, and it's also that when he decides he's going to rename himself, it's not that Julie did, it's he decided to rename himself.
Yes.
And
so his name was Juan, and everyone called him Wand or Juan. And just to make it easier for himself, he decided he would change his name to Jack. And I have known kids who have changed their names. And so I felt like that was a really interesting detail. And that's why I included it.
do you think you'll write another book with them, with Juan being older, with Jack being an older?
That's such a good question. You know, the story, the theme of adoption is absolutely fascinating to me, because to me, it's the primary story. It's so important, you know, to me. So if I think I might take a break from it, but you know, I don't know if I would continue this story. I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question. Maybe maybe. maybe, as how he navigates his world.
Well, I think that to me, it's fascinating too, because even where you leave the book, I want to know so much more. And like, how does, would there be a sequel? Have you ever thought about like what happens afterwards? That kind of, and I think that's why I love the book, because it leaves it open to all these different things.
Well, you know, yeah, I wanted the reader to put himself in the shoes of the people in the book. I wanted you to think, what would I do? How would this affect me? What decisions would I make in the same situation? You know, and to really sort of implicate you, to implicate the reader in the emotional journey of the book, and to feel that attached to it, that you feel like, well, what's going to happen and what would I do? Mm-hmm.
Well, at the end of the book, I really get why you called it Mother Mother. But did you have another title originally in mind, or is this the reason that you've decided to stick to Mother Mother as the title of the book?
Oh, that my working title for a few years was What We Believed. That was my working title. And after the process of writing the book, I understood then that it was actually the story of two mothers, and that it needed to be Mother Mother. But so no, it wasn't my title from the beginning.
Well, it's one of these things that, like, at first I was like, why would you name it Mother Mother? But I mean, when you guys read this book, you'll understand why it's called Mother Mother. This is like, it's when these two things come together. And I think that was why, I mean, like when I was done, I was like, oh, this makes perfect sense. It's the perfect title for the book. But yeah, I just didn't know if that, but yeah, it had a different, What We Believe is the good title too. But yeah, I mean, I think I got most of the big points. The other stuff is like, I think it's just more about, I don't want to give away the spoilers, so people you do have to read this. There are some, like I said, some really emotional parts in there. And a Piper's story is also one of these really emotional ones, but I don't want to talk too much about Piper because I want people to read the book. But I think too, it's just Julie's work life too. It's like, I don't know if do you work at a museum? How did you come about to have Julie working at the Clay?
Well, so I got my MFA at Antioch in Los Angeles, and I had this wonderful advisor named Steve Heller. And one of the questions he asked me during the process of the book was, does Julie think about anything besides adoption? You know, this book, I mean, what else is happening in her life? And of course, I thought to myself, no, she doesn't. She absolutely does. This is all she thinks about. But he said, you know, she really needs to have another life outside of this. And so I have worked for many, many years in the art field. I worked my first job, after working in magazine publishing and book publishing in New York, I lived in New York City for 9 years. And then I moved to California. And my first job was at the LA County Museum. And I edited the members magazine. And I also wrote press releases, thousands, hundreds at least of press releases. And so I know the art world very well. So I worked at the LA County, and then I got a job at the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, in La Jolla. Mm-hmm. And I was the press officer there, the head of the PR there. And then I moved to SF MoMA. When I met my husband, I moved up to San Francisco and I got a job at SF MoMA. So I've worked at 3 major museums in California, and I know museums really well. And I love museums and I love working in the art world, but you know, it's a very rarefied, very specific environment. And I've really never read a novel that's set in an art museum, in a work environment. And so I thought, all right, I'll give her a job in an art museum. So she's a curator, and I know many curators. And in fact, one weekend I sat down with 3 of my friends who are curatorial types, and we talked about what it feels like to be a curator, how you look at a work of art as a curator. I was taking notes, and that's how that whole piece of the story came in, and that became a frame for Julie's life outside of her relationship with her husband, Mark, and her adoption with Juan.
Well, yeah, and you get a fascinating look into the art world, because Julie is discovering these artists at the beginning of their careers. And the one where there's the mean director who got the job instead of her. When she missed that one artist who ends up going to La Jolla and blowing up, and she's missed this one, and then the one that she had with the light. When I was in art school, I remember an installation where it was all done with light, so I could totally see it in my head. But it was just a great, fascinating way to delve into the art world that a lot of people don't see. And if you go to museums, you don't realize how much work can go behind an installation. We don't get into the nitty gritty of, putting everything up on the walls, but it was just fascinating where they get to go on the little bus trip to the artist's studio to see that. I thought these were these fascinating, and especially for me, who's new to the Bay Area. I'm from Southern California, so I've only been in Larkspur since January, so I'm really new. So it's like riding around in a book to see the places that I've been quarantined and haven't been able to visit.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about this. This book is like armchair travel, right? You get to go to Guatemala, you get to go to art museums, you get to go to galleries, as we're all stuck in our homes. That's really interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I think you've given Julie such great depth. I think that to have that both, because we know that those are the turmoil of the adoption and all the stuff that comes with even after getting Jack home. And then there's and I think nailed a lot of stuff that people who have adopted. And if you've seen in the newspaper, the story about the woman who put her child back on a plane to send back to Europe was in the book. And that's a real life thing that really did happen. People don't think it happened, but this is why some countries now don't want to adopt to the United States anymore. You covered a lot of that in this novel, and it's just a wonderful thing. But let's open it up. Does anybody in the audience have any questions? I see one popped up here. There are 3 very different questions for QA, no rush. So who are some of your favorite novelists?
Right now I'm reading Alice McDermott, and she, That Night was one of her early books, and Charming Billy was another book, and I've just sort of been going back to her. Another one, interestingly, is Jane Smiley. So I kind of revisit books that I love, and so The Age of Grief had such an impact on me when I was writing this book. Actually, I would sometimes sit there with that book it's by Jane Smiley. I think it's just a short story or a novella. I would sit there with it on my desk and just read it. And same with Alice McDermott, Charming Billy. That was another one that really had an effect on me, those books and those writers. Mm-hmm. And
so, how did you know that your novel was complete?
Oh my gosh. I thought it was complete a few times. I thought it was complete 6 months before it really was complete. And that was kind of a novice mistake, I think. I wanted it to be complete because I was so tired of working on it. And I was hoping it was finished. And then when I got some feedback that it wasn't quite where it needed to be, that was when I really rolled up my sleeves and went back to it. And that said, after 6 months of really just hammering away at it, cutting and moving things, it was one time. I knew it was done. I can't explain it. I think that as a writer, you just know there's nothing else you can do to improve this book. You've done everything you can do to improve it. Mm-hmm.
No, and you did, you gave the manuscript to a few different readers as well. I saw that in your acknowledgements.
Yes, so many. And to all of you who read it in early versions, thank you. Many versions. And I will say, I think one of my strongest I think one of my strengths as a writer is my ability to take criticism. And I am very able to listen to people's criticism. And I make sure that I'm asking people whose opinion I trust, but I am willing to go back and try to really hear what someone's saying and to try to understand what they're saying and why, and really work to fix it. I think that's one of my strengths. And I would say to anyone who's a writer out there, that's something that we need to be open to, that other people might be able to see it with fresh eyes. And that's a good thing.
So the next question, well, I know this is not your first book. This is your first work of fiction. Your first book was the memoir, Mamalita, which is nonfiction. So the question is, are you working on a second novel yet? Or are you working on another nonfiction book?
Not at the moment. Right now, you probably hear my dog barking, by the way. I'm wondering what's going on out there. But right now, my kids are in online school and my daughter's a senior and I'm trying to get her through. And to be honest, this book took a lot out of me. This book really took a lot out of me. And, I hear people who say, oh, I finished this book and then I turned around and started another one. That's just not me. I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. I don't know what my next project will be.
Okay, and then so Jack is asking, she says, hi Jessica, Jack here. I'm just started the book and about 20% in already. I noticed myself recognizing significant subtext with embedded intelligence, insights, and emotion. How intentional was this? Because I got it from the very get-go. So
well, hi, Jack. Thank you for your question. Interesting. I actually wanted Julie, my narrator, to have an arc where she really grows and develops insight into what she's doing. In the beginning, it's all emotion about what I want, what she wants, she wants to become a mother. And then as she develops as a mother, it becomes much more child-centered and it becomes about her child. But I was interested in mining feelings and emotion because I think that's what's interesting to me as a reader. I really want to go into a character and understand what motivates them. So yes, it was intentional in that. And I also wanted the reader to understand how the characters were each feeling. Mm-hmm.
And you do get that story arc at the end. There's so much growth and learning and heartbreak and continuation. Julie's the kind of person who's gonna, no matter what, is gonna endure and get through it and push through just to make sure that Jack is going to have the life that he deserves. So you did a great job, Jessica. So the next two questions really are, have your children read the book and what do they think?
That's such, my kids haven't read anything I've written. I mean, I think it's sort of like when there used to be an old joke my mother used to tell me, that if you were the shoemaker, your kids were walking around in shoes that weren't new, it was like that's what she would say. And, I'm the writer. And so my kids don't really want to read what I've written. So the answer to your question is no, they haven't. And in fact, my daughter is the subject of my memoir, her adoption, and she hasn't read that either. She hasn't read Mamalita, and neither has my son, Mateo. But Mateo, he's a very curious kid. And so I started keeping journals when I was young. My first, probably I say when I was 10, but now when I look back, I was probably 8. Well, Mateo recently was downstairs in our kind of storage area and he found some of my early journals and he started reading them. And so it's possible that someday they might read my books, but no, not yet. But I was concerned about that. I was concerned about how they would feel about me writing about Guatemalan adoption. But I have assured them that this is not my story. This is Julie's story. This is Julie Cowan's story. This is Juan Cowan's story. Jack, this is Mark. This is not my story. And in fact, I made a deliberate deliberate decision not to write another memoir because I felt like I had said everything I needed to say and everything I was going to say in Mamalita, and I didn't want to explore that anymore. I wanted to explore what I call truth with a capital T, but not my truth. It's not a true story, but I hope it involves truth.
Well, it's not a true story in a sense, but you've done a lot of research, so it has
Yeah.
a lot of truth in it.
Yes, it has a lot of truth, and it's definitely historically based. It's historically based. The only fact in the book that is not completely accurate is that in my book, adoptions closed in 2002 because it worked for my timeline. And in Guatemala, adoptions closed in 2007. And in real life, adoptions closed in 2007. So somebody asked me recently, I was at an informal gathering and they said, you know, it was a mother who knew a lot about Guatemalan adoption. And she said, the only thing that bothered me about your book was that adoption closed in 2007. And you said it closed in 2002. And I said, well, I really needed to do that. And I said, when I was in a workshop once with Richard Russo, who was my workshop leader. And in fact, I said to him, this is one of my fears that I want to change the date on this. Am I allowed to do this? Because I had never written fiction before. And he said, Jessica, is this a true story? Is this a novel? And I said, yeah, it's a novel. It's fiction. He said, so it's fiction. You're making it up. He said, did this actually happen? And I said, no, and he said, well, then you can put it whenever you need to put it. And that's okay. That's the right of a fiction writer. So that was really the only factual detail that I really agonized over. But everything about the history of Guatemala, the president of Guatemala, Arbenz, who was deposed, United Fruit's presence in Guatemala, the 36-year conflict, the number of massacres, 200,000 indigenous people dead, all of that is true.
So that leads me to another question. So how long, with all that research, did it take to write this novel?
So I spent 7 years writing this novel, 7 years. Now, that said, I have two kids who started when they were little, and now my daughter's 18. You know, my son, both my parents passed during the time I was writing this, and there was a lot involved with that, of course. There was all kinds of school changes for my kids. There was a lot of life that was happening. So it wasn't as if I was sitting down for 7 years, you know, uninterrupted, you know, writing this book. There was a lot of interruption. But it did take 7 years, but yes, and there was so much research, but my understanding of Guatemala also deepened during that time. You know, I mean, the more I got to travel in Guatemala, the more I got to meet people in Guatemala. I'll just tell you a very quick story. When you asked how, you know, Rosalba's story began with the massacre, I'll just say quickly, we had hired a driver to go to Neba, which is the Ixil area, which is what I write about, where Rosalba's from, up in the northwest part of the country. And we hired a driver and for 10 days who drove us all around. And by day 5, you know, you start talking about your life because there's only so much, you know, you're eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner together, you're in a car together, and he said, when I was 10 years old, this is what happened. And it was like, this first person, this man telling me he had gone out into the woods and he had seen this encampment of tents. And he didn't know if it was the army or the subversives. And that just, you know, the whole story just came to me. And, you know, going to villages in Guatemala, seeing cemeteries, going to the museum of the conflict in Rabinal. So in a way, I'm really grateful for all those disturbances in my life because it slowed the process. And as the process slowed, I was able to go deeper.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question that came in. If you're a pre-adoptive parent picks up this book, what message do you hope they will gain?
If you're a pre-adoptive parent, I hope you will adopt. I hope you will see how beautiful it is to form a family through adoption, how challenging it is to go in with your, and by challenging, I mean to go in with your eyes open of what your child has already experienced before he or she ever came to you. I always say your child comes with a backstory, and to acknowledge that backstory. So I think that was your question. What would I say to you? Just be aware that the story starts with you. You're chapter 2. There's already a chapter 1 that happened before, and that there's another family in your life, and that's your child's birth family. Mm-hmm.
So Astrid Castro says hello and thank you.
Oh. Thank you.
Adrian Phillips says hello. I miss Coronado too, but I'm here in Larkspur now. But and they love the book as well. And so Jack's also asking, are there, other than using it as a literary tool, what did you want to accomplish with the shifting timelines? Did you think it was more effective than it, if you had applied a strictly linear approach?
Well, Rosalba's story, I really needed to start Rosalba's story with the conflict. I really wanted readers to understand that part of Guatemalan history, because I think it's not really advertised in the United States. The story of what happened in Guatemala with the president being deposed in 1954, and that was really the beginning of the instability of the government. So the timelines didn't really line up because I needed to start Rosalba's story farther back. And then I tried to, tie them up at the end. So that was the decision behind that.
I think too, because Rosalba's story starts in the 80s. So it's like this huge leap back in time. And I think that was what sort of threw me, but it works because you really need to get her story of where she comes to the point where she has to make that choice. And two, even Rosalba has such an innocence to her because she's lived in this life. And so even when she's sexually assaulted, it's usually that's such a horrifying topic, but she's so worried about all these other things that the sexual assault, when most stories and books this would be a huge chunk of it, but this is just one more moment in her life of how do you put it, when she's not had the greatest life to begin with, and where she's at, that this is just one more thing because she's afraid of losing so much that she barely has. And yeah,
that's well said, Franklin. She's afraid of losing and she has so little in the beginning. I tried to, in Rosalba's voice, I tried to communicate the bravery that I see in women in Guatemala, this kind of stoicism that I see, and a kind of stillness. And by stillness, I mean this kind of like centeredness that I observe in my immediate circle and in people I observe. And I really respect that so much. And I try to incorporate that into her voice. So that's where that comes from.
So there's lots of thank yous, great interview. Jack, keep reading. It's a great book. Like I said, it's an emotional roller coaster. You're gonna, and it is a fast read. You did a great job of making it. It is truly one of those books that you don't want to put down. That I read it, in 2 days, which is, that's all I did was read it. I knew I had to interview you too, but it's great when I can just chug through a book. The pace is going. I kept with the storyline, and like I said, I really want to know what's next, what's coming next, and if there would be a sequel. And I think your characters have enough growth that when you have I guess decompressed from all this emotion, Jessica, that you'll pick up another storyline. And I can't wait to read what you have next. I need to go back and read your memoir, but this, like I said, it was a great fiction novel, and I'm excited to see what you work on next. But I think we're almost out of time, but thank you, Jessica.
Oh, thank you, Franklin. I'm so grateful to you for having this local author series, and I'm honored that you or interviewing me. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for coming. And can I give a quick shout out for the cover artist, Hugo Ayala, who's a Guatemalan painter who gave me permission to use his painting. I own a number of his works, including this painting. And I'm really, really thrilled and grateful that he gave me permission to use this on the cover. So I was really happy about that. And again, thank you.
And where can they find your book at?
Oh, so my book is available on IndieBound. If you're an independent bookseller, a book buyer, my book launch was in Portland at Annie Bloom's. I'm so grateful to them. You can buy it at your local bookstore. You can buy it at a local Marin bookstore. And of course, it's available on Amazon. And if you do read the book, I would be so grateful if you would leave a review somewhere so it can influence other readers' decisions. So I feel so strongly about this subject. I feel like I really needed to tell this story. And I'm just so grateful it's out in the world. And I'm so grateful to anyone who reads it. Thank you.
No, and thank you for sharing this with us. It'll also be added to the Larkspur Library collection. So eventually you'll be able to check it out. But again, thank you for joining us, Jessica. For all of those who attended, I'll be sending out a link with the link to the recording. We'll include a little book trailer for Mamalita that Jessica shared with me. That's her first nonfiction work that she wrote. That it's also in the library's collection, so you can check that out as well, or buy it at your favorite bookstore. But again, thank you, Jessica, for joining us today. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. We'll have some more author events come January. The library, we're a little short-staffed the next 2 months, so we're going to take a break. But back in January, keep your eye out for our next author. But I'm so happy that Jessica was here, and we'll probably have her come back when her next book comes out, or we'll have her come back to talk about Mamalita. But thank you again for sharing the story. And like I said, this honestly it's a great book. I encourage everybody, if you haven't read it, go read it. It's a good book, and I'm glad I read it. So this is, it's one of those things. I just loved it. So thanks, Jessica.
Oh, thank you. It's so wonderful of you to tell me that. It's so generous of you to tell me that. Franklin, I'm so glad you liked it. Thank you.
Well, we're librarians. We love books and we love authors too. So thank you for spending this time with us. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you next time. So.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Didn't have my daughter. Our adoption agency was doing nothing. I quit my job and moved to Antigua to finish the case myself. As my lawyer once told me, this is not Paris. This is not Argentina. This is Guatemala. Things are different here. Despite the warnings, I would cross the line, go to official offices, knock on doors, struggle to communicate in my broken Spanish, trying to find someone to help me. How far should I go? Was there no one I could trust? There was talk of influence, bribes. I would do anything to get my daughter out. Anything.